Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm not sure what time it is, when you are watching this, where you are watching this, but thank you for joining me. If you do join me, I am Dr. Ulises Moreno Tavares. I go by are acceptable because I have those kinds of social constructions of my name in my head. Anyway, this feels like a bit of a blog, personal blog. And so I think I've tried to record this 3 times and some of like personal thoughts and feelings are coming out when they shouldn't. And so I'm trying to just keep it as professional as possible while in my office here in Acapulco, Guerrero, Mexico. It is a southern state. It is where I live and work and where I research and also where I am from. I am from here. I migrated early at the age of 11 to the United States. I lived in Phoenix. I've lived in Texas. I've lived in Los Angeles most of my life. It's where I went to school, where I work and went to school as an undocumented student. I finished my undergraduate in rhetoric. My degree. So I left to China, and in China, I worked as an LGBT activist teaching English, more so the latter than the former, but the effort was made and the article came out of that, which is nice. I then applied to the London School of Economics for Human Geography and Urban Studies, and I was awarded a PhD scholarship, which is where I went and where I worked on my PhD for 5 years, researching the lives of Latin American migrants in London. What else can I tell you about me? During that time, I finished my thesis here in Cuernavaca, where my family lives now. And then I started a personal journey, research journey, um, in the coastal regions of Guerrero, which is again where I'm from. I was trying to research family histories and just make sure that I understood more about myself. I know it seems rather not solipsistic, but self-referential. Yet again, I never afforded myself that kind of knowledge in all the geographies where I lived before. So I decided to embark in that research. I lived in a small city called Ometepe, which is a central city in Costa Chica. And Costa Chica is the southern part of the state of Guerrero below Acapulco, still a coastal region. And it is bordering Oaxaca. So my research was around that area. It was ethnographic research, participatory. And so that's where the project that I'm going to talk to you about comes from today. Um, and so I hope to tell you a little bit about where that comes from and what this work entails. Hopefully, in doing so, this translates into an experience that you might have in the process of writing and co-writing in this particular workshop series. So let me share with you my screen. Here you have, whoa. There we are. So I title it Writing from the Littoral, Making Coastal Commons in City. Bilingual visual essays, first time local authors, editorial accompaniment. So this particular project called Coastal Commons was also funded by the Urban Studies Foundation, the seminar series that you are part of. And so I'm participating also in the epistemes of non-dominant inhabitation. So I'm making space for coastal comments. I'm writing several blogs that retell the story of the work that we have done in the past 6 years or so. So the first blog begins with slowness because collaboration had to answer to coastal conditions. And there's a different rhythm, obviously, here in terms of city life. This is small cities. And the fact that I call them cities is itself contested when the products that I share with a reviewer come up for review. Um, so basically, I'm talking about the conditions um, that make up coastal commons, or the conditions that we had to work under um, in order to basically come up with this project and continue with the project, right? So I'm saying here why the project had stretched. So there are weather interruptions, illness, migrations, illness, COVID-19, by the way, migration, weak connectivity, which you might have in this particular recording. I just got a notice that my internet connection was unstable. So apologies for that, but it is where I work and how I work, and some of you may relate, others cannot. But local calendars are another issues that we had to work around. Work and care kept changing the timetables. This is in 2019, so to 2022. It is work that gave birth to Coastal Commons, basically. Urban Studies Foundation picked up the project. They support us with time and space to work on the pace of collaboration required. I think we were given much extra time, much more time than other projects were, because we set out front that we were unsure of the conditions that we were exploring and that we were working in collaborative nature, which takes a different different type of work. So, excuse me. The coast here is not one setting. Guerrero and Oaxaca carry different histories, authorities, hurricanes, earthquakes, memories, and ways of understanding life. The visits were not a preliminary step before the real work, they were the work. I'm talking about the visits, the site visits that we did. So I want to say that I started first. And when I went there, I started creating, I started talking to collectives, and I conducted workshops on global development to try to understand how they understood local development in relation to that broader framework of development and its historical trajectories, especially as they impacted Mexico, southern Mexico, in particular Guerrero, which is, by some metrics, one of the poorest states in the country. So it required basically repeated presence by myself, and then there's slow group like coalescing around shared meals, conversations, and the practical labor of staying in touch, particularly during COVID-19 and the pandemic, and how that interrupted all types of communications, but at the same time, through ways like Zoom and other methods, we kept in touch. And so, yeah, it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing, but we know this. So this is me making space for what Coastal Commons is, or what it became rather. Through these series of workshops, we created a core group that kept in touch and kept working around these issues. So, what making space names? I'm talking about the blog Making Space. So coastal commons becomes a chain of methods, relationship, and places before it became a journal project. I'm talking about a journal project here because I'm going to eventually tell you about the product that came out of this particular project, and how it evolved into that. So I'm telling you about four strands here that of work that we conducted basically. So these were site visits, in local dialogues with cooperatives, women's organizations, activists, groups, advocates, and traditional authorities. Um, Official authorities are different from traditional authorities, but we also worked with them to a lesser degree, primarily because of the political party divide that characterizes the type of work that we were doing, collective, cooperative work, in opposition to hierarchical work that privileged political parties. So this sometimes basically we ran into a bit of conflict, but we overcame that through basically constant presence, which is what I was telling you about before in terms of what the work required. So we work in an Afro, and this is the Costa Chica is an Afro-Indigenous geography. What this means is that basically Black and Indigenous peoples settled here pre and post colonization, and during colonization. This was an intense kind of relationship that fostered between these peoples. And currently, while they live 30 minutes apart, one geography is known as a Black geography, whereas in another geography, again, 30 minutes apart, is known as an Indigenous geography. Yet these are official categories that the state is currently working through and imposing to a certain degree. And it erases 500 years of different relationships that coalesced around, I say, violence and love in different other settings. So what we did in our project is we tried to build Afro-Indigenous consciousness through youth workshops and adult reading circles, trying to understand some of the local literature about Black peoples and Indigenous peoples that has been written. So this meant basically creating a kind of library of local works that have been written and documented around this. And sometimes the academic language needed to be just basically narrowed down and simplified for youth audiences as well as adult audiences that sometimes didn't know exactly, basically, they didn't know how to read or write, but we needed to communicate that. The knowledge that we were sharing. And so we had different people doing that within our group, within our networks. So it became sort of that idea of like a network kind of, I call it coalition. And I think one of the theorists of coalition is Karma Chavez, whose work I love and whose work on queer migrations is brilliant because she documents how in the United States queer movements and migration movements come together and coalesce. And the idea of coalescing or coalition work is that we don't always we work on a project together and we might separate, but we're still part of something. And so that's kind of what our work entailed. Convivencia is a term we use locally to basically say that we are sharing space and time, and we are working together. And so as such, we used workshops using theater, textiles, ethnobotany, painting, and environmental storytelling. We also produced community videos and bilingual writing, including Memorias en el Agua, Justicia Energética, and unfinished work that still matters. I'll get to that later, but these videos can be found on our blog on City's page. City hosted these blogs, and they have these videos that we produced. Some of them are locally produced by indigenous youth, and we taught them how to do documentary video using their own resources. And so the work feels like it's very amateur, and it is, but at the same time, these like the content itself is quite legible, and it is, for instance, the energy justice videos are the energy justice videos are very much self-produced, and so the knowledge is that's gathered there is for documentation that continues to be cited locally. So what emerged here was a living archive of videos, essays, recordings, workshop materials, photographs, and notes. Some of that stuff we keep to our own, and other stuff we are publishing in the blog, and other stuff we are publishing in journals. One of the journals is City, and the other journal is Urban Studies. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Coastal Commons, a seminar fit, just in terms of the writing project as a response to non-dominant inhabitation and epistemic justice. I don't know how long I'm running at the moment. I apologize here for the time, but it's difficult not having an audience to think with and through, even if it's virtual. And so I'm thinking about the pressures that your project brings to the ways in which the knowledge that I can bring to the table. So I think in the invitation, there are three pressures for me to think about: decentering dominant urban knowledge, support early career and underrepresented scholars, and then treat writing and publishing as part of the politics of inhabitation. I very late in the game, but I want to thank Paroj Banerjee and the team of this project for hosting me. And again, apologies for not being present when I needed to be, but I'm present here virtually and hope that I can be of service somehow. So my response is that a writing project rather than a simple article. So you might have an individual article, but think of this as a writing project rather than that individual project, just so as to not feel like you are writing alone and to feel like you are speaking to a broader public and a broader issue. So this is how we approached Coastal Commons. It wasn't that at first, but it became so because our question was, what does urbanization mean for you in this particular geography, this small city, right? So my response is that Coastal Commons approached urban life through water, work, ritual, migration, tourism, disaster, and repair in small coastal cities. The practical question was how to move firsthand, bilingual, locally grounded, basically locally grounded work, and how we translated that into an international journal project without necessarily stripping out our voice. So the series, which is also funded by the Urban Studies Foundation, is designed to to support full article drafts, visual essays, visual language, writing and publishing sessions, and scholar activist co-productions. That's what the project entailed, and as I've been mentioning, the work that we did in Coastal Commons, that's what the project entails. So it was very hands-on and very a lot of work that needed to be done locally. Excuse the redundancy, but Coastal Commons as a writing infrastructure. So a chain of relationships, methods, and places rather than a single output. So we don't treat Costa Chica as basically a single geography. This kind of erases the diversity that I was telling you about earlier, which is that they live 30 minutes apart and they think of themselves as different. They even narrate the stories differently, but under there are core commonalities that are part of their core infrastructure. And so we began the project in I began the project in 2019 when I started doing this work. And slowly we started collectivizing workshops basically were on water, health, extractivism and corruption, and unregulated urbanization. The blog tells you a bit more about the different projects that we were doing. And so I'll share the link with Faroj so she could share with you so you could take a look at the blog and read further. From 2021 onwards, it became a multi-sided chain of visits, workshops, screenings, seminars, translations, edits, and follow-ups across Guerrero and Oaxaca, which are again states in southern Mexico. We found an institutional home with the Universidad Autónoma Guerrero, which is where I currently work in the Masters of Sustainable Development Management or Management of or for Sustainable Development. So with the Urban Studies Foundation support, giving the work time and space to grow at the pace and collaboration required. We set out a particular agenda. We had our own clock that we pitched to the Urban Studies Foundation, which changed in some ways drastically, particularly because we were working under pandemic conditions. So what it became, it was not one event, but a field of relationships from which writing could emerge across. These are small cities in Costa Chica, which are Xochitlahuaca, Ometepec, Coajinicuilapa, Azoyú, San Marcos, Acapulco, and the Oaxaca coast, and small and medium-sized cities with different relations to urbanity or urbanization and different modes of inhabitation. So again, we wanted to write something, and we had a question that we wanted to explore. And that question is, what does urbanization mean to you? So most of you are perhaps urbanists, and you speak a particular language that you've been trained under. That particular language carries its own weight because of the technicalities that are used in publishing, the publishing world, of the keywords that you use in order to perhaps gain more traction in terms of visibility, citation ability. And so that becomes a set of, as I'm explaining here, a chain of relationships, methods, and places rather than a single output. And so that's what urbanization means. And we needed to produce something that basically privileged the perspective and language of local peoples, people that didn't speak or don't speak this particular language that we speak of urbanization. So then the Urban Studies Foundation gave us money for equipment, which was a computer through which I am speaking through to you at the moment. They gave us cameras, a drone, basically money to buy equipment. And so we purchased that equipment. And when we did so, we gave and shared the equipment with trusted participants and asked them that question, what does urbanization mean to you? Now, we did have a series of workshops, site visits, and shared readings that we conducted in the process. And again, we used local language to try to communicate this. And sometimes that language was given back to us in local speak. So that type of knowledge sharing is documented, yet Not everybody that participated in the core group was an urbanist or understood. Matter of fact, I think I was the only quote unquote urbanist. I never considered myself that, but I became that in terms of speaking to the foundation so that we could get the funding for the work that we conducted, right? So I think we've talked about repeated presence and trust building. We conducted site visits basically after we gave them the equipment. We shared the equipment, and so this was collaborative media making and visual experimentation. This was different groups in society. Some of them were the organizing groups that organize an event in Azoyu, or youth in Xochitlahuaca, indigenous youth in Xochitlahuaca, and it was particularly indigenous girls in Xochitlahuaca who basically organized around this idea of energy justice. And I've also worked with street vendors in Ometepec, which is the central city where I work, but that project is still in the making. So this project is still very much alive. It continues on, even though it doesn't have institutional funding from the Urban Studies Foundation. So we started writing things in English and Spanish, but I think at the end of the day, decided that the language that we could speak is this visual experimentation. So we asked them to take pictures of what urbanization meant to them and how they experienced this in their local communities where they lived and work and where they're from. Again, this consisted of repeated drafting in English and Spanish, translation, line editing, and voice protection, editorial conversations, peer review, return, and selective opacity. Selective opacity means that some things the community didn't want us to talk about, or that for protection of our researchers, we couldn't talk about. And so we leave those things out of the frame. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Obviously, it's a frame. A frame cuts a lot of things out. So local people understand local contexts. And this work, I want to say that is primarily made for local audiences. And we wrote to an international audience in a different language, primarily because we wanted to make visible the work that we were doing and the process under which we undertook this work. So community authorship here does not move on institutional timelines. It moves with consent, assembly, grief, revision, and trust. A lot of that had to do with COVID, in terms of grief. In terms of consent, again, we had to go to, for instance, the video of Azoyu and La Llorada, which I will tell you about in a moment, consists of work that we had to take to the local assemblies and ask them if this version was okay. And they would say, take out this thing, or I don't want to be seen this way, and redo this interview. And so we would do that. And the version that we have now, I have to say, is not the final version, but it is a version that they approved. And so we want to produce a different, shorter version, which is around 20 minutes. That requires consent again. So that means going back to the assemblies and asking them. I know that for the requirements that we have for publishing, this is a headache because we want to move and the institution demands that we move faster than we do. And so I shared stories of my illness starting this talk. And I think it becomes evident here that I don't move under institutional timelines, at least not as it requires. We need to slow down and say, hey, I need this time and space. And while I was terribly sorry to not be present. I also have to tell you that the conditions under which I live, quite literally, are in are conditions that basically require institutional timelines to move around my necessities. That doesn't always happen, and I'm not always accommodated. But I also thank Paroj for giving me the opportunity to record this. And I feel like I'm taking this forever, and perhaps I'm talking too much. Anyway, the essay breakdown, part one. So the framing essay held the issue together by defining the literal as work, water, ritual, governance, and everyday survival at a close range. This is my personal, it is co-written with my postdoctoral um, researcher, director, anyway, co-researcher. So this article is the theoretical article that binds the pieces together, and it is for this piece in particular my favorite piece because it really theorizes around the work that I've been doing, and it was beautiful to think of this work in such theoretical terms because it gave me the opportunity to value my geography and value the work that I've been doing for the past 3 months. There are times where I work and live in, well, I live in I'm sorry, I work in an Anglophone, for an Anglophone audience, but at the same time, I live in an Hispanophone, in a Spanish-speaking world, and also other languages, as you will notice in the essays. So this becomes an issue of me trying to publish something or me trying to enter into the Anglophone speaking world and feeling like I don't matter, like I don't have a voice, like I am sidelined. And that carries its own emotional toll in terms of affect labor that I'm required to do in order to try to enter into these spaces. And so the question is, why try to enter these spaces? Well, it's not the only spaces that I try to enter. I very much work and live locally, and I think the work that I've been doing speaks for itself. But at the same time, the work that I present here also tries to negotiate this tension that I feel in this affect labor of valuation that I have to do about the significance of my work, the significance of my geography, the history of my geography, and how I present that to the world. And so that matters a lot to me. And this work, the theoretical work that I did here, I think helped me in that sense. And a lot of the editorials that I've written for City try to do that work as well. And I'm still trying to capture what all that means. But I think it needs a lengthier platform, perhaps not here. So getting to the essays, Dulce Quintero Romero speaks of women of Huida post Otis Acapulco. Otis was a hurricane that devastated the city completely. I'm talking about hospitals not working. The clinic where I attend for hemodialysis was closed down. I couldn't get out of the city for 3 days. Finally, I was able to get out, and I had to go to a different city in order to attend medical needs that I have. So that basically is the context that Acapulco was living under, and WIDA is a Indigenous Migrant Women's organization of workers, beach workers, women workers who work at the beach. Sorry for the redundancy. They work and sell items at the beach, and they created a unions to protect each other against abuses from either the other sellers, other vendors, uh, the government itself. They work under conditions that are not official. And so they're extra official, extra legal sometimes, but they hold together care, beach, vending, mutual aid, and recovery in a city that depends on their labor. It's that touristy work that is that tourist work that often makes tourists feel like, well, I'm not her. And when they experience these kinds of sentiments, it becomes relevant in terms of how these hierarchies that touristification upholds, how they need to survive that, and how the care work that they do between themselves matters. And so Dulce documents that Miguel Liboria Maceda, in his article Roots and Ruptures, talks about roads, electricity, and consumer goods and how they reshape the city where he's from, which is also you, and how yet ritual and collective care remain under pressure. Um, the I think the video that we have about Azuyu is about La Llorada in this particular town, which is an event that takes place every year where the town splits in half. And one is called the People of Reason, and the other is called the Indians. So that carries its own historical weight. Nowadays, they recognize that, so they call themselves the West and the East. And in doing that, they reshape their relationships, which are still laden with historical hierarchies that they need to negotiate. So this city in particular, it's a small town, and they came up with this ritual where the town splits in half. They have a party, and at 6 p.m. they come together and they share little I forget what they're called, but they're chains of flowers that they put around their necks, and they share them with they make them throughout the day, and then at the end of the day, at 6 p.m. when the town comes together at the town center, they share these things and they cry. They literally make themselves cry, asking each other for forgiveness. It's a day of atonement for the transgressions that they may have committed between themselves. And so it becomes a day of atonement where they ask for forgiveness through their tears. So it's a unique event, and you might get the hints that this event itself is significant because it is negotiating historical ruptures. But they share the roots, so they're negotiating them through this particular ritual, which is changing, and that's why it remains under pressure. Miguel doesn't necessarily document this particular instance, but the video that is in the blog does. So Kayla Martinez talks about paths and patterns of the Namkwanyomda. The Namkwanyomda are the Amuzco peoples of the Costa Chica. It's an indigenous group that has about 5 different small cities in the coast, and each of them, while they might live again 30 minutes apart, they speak the same language but with different accents, and so they don't necessarily understand each other. When I lived in China, I think I told you about that. When I lived in China, I experienced this where Southern Chinese couldn't understand Northern Chinese, even though they spoke the same language, because of the accents and the ways of speaking, and because they spoke indigenous languages in relation to Mandarin. Anyway, that's China. I'm just trying to translate, the idea that this also happens in this particular micro region. And they don't have to be that far apart for this to happen. So she talks about weaving, language, dress, mobility, and how these things show how urbanization enters the body and the home in Sulha. Sulha is their local name for the city, although it is called Xochitlahuaca. So Chislahuaca is a name that the Mexica Empire bestowed upon them when they conquered them. And they are reclaiming that name to say, well, we appreciate you, but we are called Sulha. Sulha, it's actually Sulha. Um, so that's the Nanqueñum. The Christopher del Valle brings us a story that is a family narrative, which links migration, work, Hurricane Pauline, Hurricane Otis, and the peripheral urbanization in San Isidro, Labrador. He does this through a third-person storytelling about himself and his family, where he interviews his grandma and in doing so, he's talking about how local youth nowadays need to turn off the phone and turn on the memory being the ancestors that are still living, and to ask them questions and consult them on basically their own histories. It's interesting because most of the people that I worked with here, including myself, and this is how I started the research. This is how I became interested in this idea of the coast and having its own histories. So when I was growing up, I grew up in the States, and my relationship to Blackness was from a standpoint of a Hispanic Latino. Hispanic Latino is understood as different from Black, particularly in Texas and Los Angeles and the border zone with Mexico. And at least that's how I experienced it. So I want to make a key point there because I have nephews that experienced it differently in the same zone, and nephews that are descendant of peoples from this particular region and have are phenotypically Black. That's what I'm getting at. Sorry, I try to. I sometimes speak in uh, things that I have in my head, but I haven't articulated yet. I became interested in the Costa Chica because of its Blackness, because of my relationship to Blackness. Because when I came here, I saw pictures of family and started realizing that I am on both sides of my family Afro descendant in terms of where my family comes from, right? So I'm talking about dad, grandparents, great grandparents, and beyond that, great great grandparents, which I was able to trace. And so, um, what I was trying to say is that in our workshops, we often encountered this idea of Blackness as something that was foreign to us. Um, why? There's a long history of how Blackness itself was erased in official discourse because when the colony fell and Mexico gained independence, or Mexico became Mexico, there was a system that was very similar to the caste system in around the world, basically. And so this caste system was called calidad. Calidad measured your value based on family relationships, honor. How honor was defined was a whole different story. But the idea here is that calidad basically gave you a sense of status. And that status was set for hierarchy. And so there were different categorizations under calidad where Black peoples, descendants of enslaved peoples, were at the lower end of that economically, sociologically, culturally, etc. So on top were the people that were whiter, not always, but most often, whiter, richer, and more urban. So these categories became attached with their own relationships, and they have their own, so they were erased after the colony. Basically, when Mexico abolished slavery, it said one of the experimentations of Mexico's nation state making said, we will no longer have these categories. So when they did that, they didn't install any kind of reparation system. So the hierarchies, they just remained quiet, they remained unvoiced. And these categories kept perpetuating themselves where Black peoples were sociologically interpolated into desiring a wider phenotype so as to better the race, mejorando la raza, which is what we call it. Still a thing here. And basically that continues on. And so you end up with a lot of people that look like me, phenotypically not Black, whatever that means. And so when when I realized Black ancestry, I became interested in researching that. And what I was trying to say in terms of Black consciousness, beyond um, what I'm trying to say now, is that many people didn't know that they had or that they were categorically Afro-descendant, Afro-Mexican, or Black. These are three categories that run officially. Now, locally, there are different categories. But Chris was one of these people that basically we were talking about Black peoples as if they were different from the experiences that we were having. And so once we basically understood, hey, like, what about your grandpa? And so you see a picture of his grandpa here, phenotypically Black, as would be categorized here in the Costa Chica. And a bit lighter tones, but those things basically, I think for me, they redefined what Blackness meant and how Blackness was experienced in this particular geography through institutional silence. Something that has been sort of recovered, particularly as Mexico became the last Latin American country to recognize that Black peoples do indeed exist, that we are an ethnicity here in Mexico and in Guerrero, where we have the highest concentrations, at least of people that understand themselves as such. Keep in mind that in other geographies, for instance, Guadalajara, which is a major city, official statistics from the colony, from churches, they would basically categorize 33% people as Afro-descendant, 33 people as indigenous, 33% of people as indigenous, and 33% of people as mestizo or criollo, which is the wider category that you could aspire to during those times. And still, anyway, that was an aside that I think took me a bit, but I will move through part two. So the rest of the issue moved from more than human margins to youth organizations, territorial defense, and unfinished materials that still matter. Manuel Lozano Ortiz, Orlando, who is part of this collective, he wrote about urban Afro-descendant and more than human margins. So San Isidro Lavador, which is also where Chris works. So Chris presents a more artistic version of urbanization, and Orlando presents us with a more technical kind of version of what San Isidro means, the marginal town, city of San Isidro within Acapulco, what that means. And basically, it appears through the arroyo, the rock, informal housing, and the daily repair required when water is both a supply and a threat. That is particularly the arroyo, which is translated as creek, I think. It's I would call it a river when it is so full that it overloads and it exceeds its general trajectory, so much so that during a hurricane like Otis, there are reports of people being buried alive in in their homes because of the sand and rocks basically um, exceeding the what I want to say its body that generally where it generally travels through. Sorry. So Leticia, brilliant organizer. Leticia brings us birds and brigades. By the way, we did try to create this little two-word titles like coastal comments as well, so as to have like catchy titles that would be able to factor into this knowledge sharing economy. So she talks about Afro-Mexican youth in terms of participatory research and how this turned into an organization that combats, that tackles touristification through Afro Aventura tours. This basically, they work on environmental monitoring and community risk management, as well as trying to think about the local goods that they might offer a more non-corporate tourist. And this is relevant because corporate tourism is moving in. They want to replicate and high-end tourism in San Marcos because Acapulco they feel is overrun by tourists. So low-end tourists. And so they want to create a high-end touristification project. And there's been a lot of conflict. There have been deaths already. So yeah, it is an issue that they're working with. That turns into something different as well because that environmental monitoring, for instance, they teach people how to do lagoon monitoring, for instance, using non-traditional methods to document how they are how their lagoon is being affected by these touristification projects. We start actually the journal, the issue with Eladio Reyes Cruz and Juan Cristobal Yasso Aguilar with Rooted Urbanisms. Recently, since the recognition of Afro-descendants as an ethnicity in Mexico, there have been federal projects around infrastructure. One of them includes Afro Universidad. Afro Universidad is the Afro University. Yeah, so they work on agroecology, territorial defense, and institutional building in the Oaxacan coast. This particular group of people are organized around Ecosta Yutucuy. Yutucuy is the name, Mixteco name for water, I believe. And Ecosta is the same organization that basically they're the ones that built and organized so that Afro Universidad would be born so that they could have a local university where local students would stay there instead of having to migrate for studies and would receive decent education. It's all in the process and it's all institutional building, which comes with its own set of problems. They don't always talk about that, but we tried to hint at those in the journal article. There's so much we can say, particularly when we are building. Anyway, I wanted to end this particular thing. It's in terms of the outside the final table of contents. We wanted to talk about La Llorada and the Ometepec vendors. We couldn't get to that. There's two articles that are missing we started with those articles and then we didn't end up with them, which is something that will happen to your project because not everyone finishes, but keep in mind that they might be moving at a different pace than the institutional pace that Urban Studies Foundations and that the organizers are requiring of you. So keep that in mind, I think, when you're working through this project, that there will be projects that might fall through, but might be picked up at a different stage or for a different audience. And so don't throw work away. So we published in English and Spanish. This is the first time that the city does this. I feel really honored and awed, I suppose, that this journal and that the editors went along with my suggestion to publish in both English and Spanish. And this is, as you see here, from the literal, desde el litoral, birds and brigades, aves y brigadas, urbanismos enraizados, apagando el teléfono. So we pushed for bilingual publication because we knew that we were responsible in some ways for what the Urban Studies Foundation gave us money for. Keep in mind that when they funded us, they told us that we could produce whatever we wanted, as long as we produced something and gave evidence of the work, which I think we did more. We very well did that, but we wanted to push ourselves in terms of our audiences, particularly because again, when we say we matter, when we say that we have value, that our histories are global histories and that they are very much local histories, we needed to articulate that not just for ourselves, but for you, the English speaker. And so an English only issue would have broken that connection to the publics that made the work possible. And translation here was editorial and political labor. It involved register, local terms, rhythms, and what should stay particularly opaque. Basically, what we could not say and what we were asked not to say. The aim here was to keep the writing answerable to international readers, as well as to organizers, the vendors, street vendors, the weavers, the artists, the activists, and the community intellectuals on the coast. That was something that I really enjoyed encountering in my own research, that most of the towns have their local historians and that they are not necessarily revered, but they have a sense of reverence towards these people who have usually very strong critical opinions and that are based in sound arguments and that are often counter-institutional to national narratives of the locality. So for background, I wrote an entire article, an entire editorial in Spanglish. Why? Because I mostly speak Spanglish with my family. I speak Spanglish with my friends in the United States. It is the language where I grew up. It is how I translate things. And so I wanted to write something in both that was latently English, latently Spanish, and somewhere in between without necessarily translating. And that becomes its own set of language and register that where I was trying to negotiate what translation meant. We're still working on that project and it's still to come. We were actually meant to meet around this time of the month, but I think we are delaying that a bit because of organizational pressures. I wanted to say that these visual essays by were mostly first-time authors and local writers, or first-time writing in English at the very least, and not necessarily in Spanish, but it was a first for city, as I mentioned. So the editorial work that this required, this was beyond line editing. So who gets to theorize the urban, in which language and in what form? That was the question that we wanted to speak to and give evidence to say, yes, we are local. Yes, we are oftentimes rural subjects, oftentimes people that have been interpreted to different forms of urbanization. In my case, different forms of urbanization around the world. And so we wanted to say, we can also talk and speak from this particular vantage point. So these people were written by people who are not invited to theorize the urban. And so that's why our question, what does urbanization mean to you? And can you use visual language to communicate that? And that's what these papers do. But they also do provide, I think, sound arguments about articulated arguments in Spanish, sometimes that were translated from Amuzgo, Nanqueñomda, or Mepa, which are the two people that live here mostly in the two cities, in the cities where we work. Not the two cities, it was it was more than two. But they are mostly found in two cities. Azuyu is for the Mepa and the Nanqueñomda are in Xochislahuaca. And so these are languages that aren't often articulated, don't appear in text. And so one of our videos is completely in Nanqueñomda and translated into Spanish as the subtitles. And so as you, I mean, the subtitles, they're already in a sense of visual hierarchy because it's literally called sub and it appears below, whereas we wanted to invert that, and at least we did so through one of our videos. It isn't the only way in which we're speaking, but that was one of the key ways. So the editorial work asked them to speak from those conditions, not to imitate a metropolitan register of expertise. I think it's really important for your work to do that. I'm not saying that our geographies necessarily need to speak to your geographies in a particular specific way, but the method here, I think, matters because it is what happens in urbanist literature. We need to speak to our urbanist audiences and even our reviewers will often ask of us to speak to that particular audience, to cite that particular author, even though it has no relevance to our particular work as it is articulated locally. So I think you and your own work, us in our own editorial activism, sorry, that it's a strong word, in our advocacy work, perhaps, and editorial advocacy work, I think we need to push for that language to appear in our work, to be articulated, and for those terms to not be translated into regional expertise or metropolitan expertise. So we need to treat images as captions and first person voice as forms of argument. We need to keep peer review, but also keep reciprocity, return, and answerability. We also need to accept selective opacity because not every detail needs to be extracted for an international readership. Sometimes it feels like, ooh, this is a sensational topic. I'm going to document this. And that has a series of consequences. Should you share that work or should that work become available to the readers that produce that kind of knowledge? Because it might not be how they want to be portrayed. It might not be how they understand themselves. And so be careful with that. That requires a sense of ethic on your part as authors and an ethic as editors of any journal that, or any review process, right, that might ask you to translate or to give more details about this. And you might say, well, wait a minute. I can't. And you need to understand that because some kinds of opacity are required and people have the right to opacity. So that comes from Edouard Glissant, Poetics of Relation. I think it's a foundational text that everyone can learn from. I cite it often in my work. And so I think the last thing that I wanted to say here is to let some work remain outside the issue when it needed more time. I'm talking about here the street vendors and the paper about La Llorada, the crying. Um, and so some things require a bit more presence, some revision. So we didn't want theory to leave the coast. We wanted to travel to where you are, but also make sure that we have an agency to reproduce it locally. We wanted to have um, to not basically we did not want to have its language cleaned elsewhere and only return as explanation. This is who you are. It's like, no, let me tell you who I am. And so that's what our articles try to do. I just wanted to end here, perhaps before I tell you before I share these things that I would tell participants and to leave you with. And I'll share a kind of sheet for you in case you don't decide to watch this entire video because you got bored along the way. I completely understand. Again, I'm sorry I'm talking to myself in this my office, and so there's a bit of an echo. But anyway, I wanted to tell you also about something different. So when I was writing and working with the local audience, I felt like this was a global thing that urban commons, or rather the coastal commons needed to be articulated as urban commons. And so I belong to a network called Community Economies Research Network. And in there, I put out a call saying, hey, is anyone working on urban commons? Because I wanted to put out a workshop where we discussed our projects. And so, yeah, basically turn those projects into papers that could be published into urban studies. Why? Because Urban Studies Foundation is funded by the earnings that Urban Studies has. And so that money is funneled into Urban Studies Foundations, and then they then distribute that money. So we put out that call. I put out that call along with um, it is a we, sorry. We put out a call, but who is we here? So, in a previous project, I worked on a paper about participatory action research. It is a paper that is widely cited in It is from Nature. The family of journals, Nature journals, and this is reviews methods primers. So this is a primer, but it's a lengthy primer about participatory action research. And it teaches basically chemists or biologists, people working in biology. Anyway, different disciplines are learning to work together using participatory action research. Um, and in doing so, they are using our work to guide their process. I think because of how widely it is cited, I think sometimes we are just cited to say that to say that people work together, but they don't always work together. At least not in the level that I'm describing. And just to put this out there, the level that I'm describing, the level that Coastal Commons required, is not something that your project might require. And that's okay. Each project has its own dynamics, its own idiosyncrasies and processes that need to be worked through. And sometimes you might need something that isn't being offered to you, but you might not raise your voice. And it isn't just raising voice, but rather creating a space within the space to say, hey, group, I am conducting this particular workshop to workshop our papers. I think that's something that you might be able to do outside these workshops that are being conducted on a bi-monthly, tri-monthly basis. before the project is over and turned into articles that will be submitted to Urban Commons. I just want to put that out there because that's basically what Urban Dialogics was. So Urban Dialogics is a space within the space. It's a project within Urban Dialogics. Just to return, this article that we published in Nature, the same authors, well, not the same, basically four that I really like working with. I invited them to this project and said, "Hey, I'm putting together this project. It requires that we be present for the workshops, that we give feedback to the papers or the projects as they stand, and that we help them along in the writing process." So that was five committed people that said, "Yes, let's do that." So we put out the call. We received 32 applications. Out of those 32 applications, we had invited 18 projects, and we conducted workshops, monthly workshops of people presenting their projects, what they were working on. The requirement was that they needed to have a rough draft and that they needed to have respondents. And the respondents came from within the same group. They weren't the editors. They were people that were part of the project. So when we chose them, we asked them, can you commit to responding to at least one, two, or three of the papers that are presented in the workshops? And they all said yes. They all finished. Okay. So we started strong, three the first month, three the second month, and so on until we came up to the fifth month when keep in mind that sometimes I needed to wake up at 4 in the morning to be present for my urban urban commons in Asia research group. So they needed to meet at a particular time, and I, as the lead editor, wanted and needed to be present so as to facilitate the workshop and chair it. So that's what I did. And other times it was just my local time zone, or early or late in my afternoon, night, etc. We negotiated different timelines so as different audiences and different workshoppers would be able to be present. We also recorded the sessions so that people who weren't able to make it or were part of a different time zone and didn't want to wake up at 3 in the morning, that they were able to view the work. So that's what happened here. And around May, one of the papers fell through, and one of the editors luckily had a paper that they were working on, and they stepped in, they presented their project, they received feedback from the workshop participants, and they had a draft for the other editors to edit and work through. Well, this continued on where basically we went through our writing phase where we just needed some time off. It couldn't be 6 months in a row. We had other obligations. We needed to officially turn in our proposal to Urban Studies, the journal. And so when we turned in our proposal, we were given feedback to fix certain things about what we were trying to do as a group. So we edited and spoke to those things until June 2025, which is when we were accepted. Not all the papers were then finished because when we were accepted, we received specific feedback to return to our authors and say, listen, you need to speak and cite these authors because that's where the conversation is. This needed to be carefully negotiated against not drowning what they were trying to contribute, but still have a coherent issue where it wasn't just urban comments and participatory action research that brought us together, but it was what those things enabled in terms of theory and how that translated onto a local context, and then what that local context might offer to a Anglophone centered audience from that particular standpoint. This as to challenge Anglophone urban commons, participatory action research literature. So that is where we are. At the end of the day, out of those 18 papers, out of those 32 applications, 13 papers made it in, and they are currently under review. If anyone wants to, well, we don't need any more reviewers. Urban Studies requires 3 reviewers per paper, and at the moment, all papers but one needs a reviewer, but I think I've identified the last one. So the point here is not individual publication. The point is to foster writing relationships beyond a single project so that pieces can speak across geographical and temporal differences. I want to emphasize here that, by the way, it says here source from Coastal Commons to Urban Dialogics because it's a third blog that that we have written so that we can preview this work before it actually comes out. So we're pushing so that it comes out, I hope, as an issue sometime in 2027. But at the moment, we have minor reviews because we took carefully into consideration what the editors were telling us, how we responded to that within each of the individual pieces. And we do have one reject. Sorry, this I guess is an aside, but we do have one reject, but it's only one of the authors or one of the reviewers out of 3. And I don't love their opinion. So at that point, if you're an editor for this particular piece, I think it's your job to advocate for the pieces and your authors, which is something that we are already drafting arguments against that particular reviewer. Okay, so to leave you with this, again, a space within a space. So I think Paroj and team have facilitated this research project, which is brilliant, which gives you an opportunity to publish in a Q1 journal, a highly respectable journal, strong editorial ethic, again, because of how they funnel the funding into what you're doing currently. But it's very important that you take ownership of the project, that you try to create a space within a space, because it should not all be given to you. At this point, I think it's important for you to acknowledge that you can also contribute to this project by perhaps creating a small workshop of other papers that you liked within the papers that have been presented so far. So something along the nature of that. I'm just putting it out there. I don't know the specifics of the project, but I think it would be wise for the project to gain that kind of footing so that people within the project can take ownership of it and say, well, I also facilitated a workshop here, and that was part of this particular project. And here, I want to say that it's within the context of urban dialogics, this was the 18 participants committing to reviewing the other projects. So it's something like that, right? Where it isn't necessarily an expert that is responding to your paper, but you are responding amongst each other and learning from one another in terms of how your knowledge production can speak to the local and speak from the local to wider audiences. Okay, I think I just want to say small coastal cities are not minor cases. They are vantage points from which urban life can be written. Otherwise, keep the writing relations open so project can speak across geography. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, please share them with Paroj, and I'm sure she'll relate them back to me. I did see a question about how somebody is working on a debates paper and what they suggested to do for that. So we also have in Urban Dialogics, we also have a debates paper that we have to go through. And in that paper, to produce that paper, we have a team of 5 people, and we are meeting monthly, basically to just talk and record our sessions and transcribe them and see if we could do some data analysis so that we could see what might be relevant to a pushy paper. I want to say pushy because that's what debates papers are supposed to be. You stand your ground, you argue for it, you put forth your arguments, your backings, all the editing of what sound argument and the debate can have, and have clear what kind of debates you're engaging and delineate them in the process so as you have a clear flow of argumentation in terms of uh, the core argument, how that splits into different sets of arguments, how those arguments are evidenced within, ideally within the work that you are doing, and then return to the debates that you are engaging and what you in your papers contribute to the debate and what your positions are. So that's how I would answer that question, primarily because we are still in that process. Okay, so just want to say there was something that I left out in terms of the things that I would share with you, and I'll give you a sheet so that you could have that I sort of wrote. So I wanted to say that you need to start from a scene that only your field site can give you. In writing for a non-dominant or non-Anglophone context, I would tell participants not to rush too quickly into the vocabulary of the field, but rather begin with the scene that no one else can give you. That scene carries relations, labor, weather, memory, and conflict before those become concepts, and those concepts are translated into articles, and how those articles might become technical knowledge or just evidence, which is not the case. So you need to let the terms do conceptual work, but gloss them with care. So when I say gloss them with care, when I say gloss local terms with care, I mean that we should not domesticate them too quickly. A word like convivencia, cabecera, apagón, banqueta, comunalidad, non-comunidad. They may carry a whole social world around them. So that needs not be translated, but rather explained in terms of the, it's like a cluster quilting that you are doing around a particular term. You are weaving different terms in different languages that speak to this particular term, or that might translate this term, understanding that this term is very much locally understood, and that should you bring in a different term in English, that it doesn't translate to that. So I think that would be something that I can share with you and encourage you to do. I would also encourage you to translate early before the argument hardens into one language. So by translating it early, I don't mean abandoning the first language. I mean letting the two languages interrupt each other before the argument becomes too rigid. So some things that sound precise in English may sound extractive or cold in Spanish, and I think listening would help you do that and then do the work of co-translating and not necessarily basically keeping the two languages hang out with each other and seeing how they relate to one another before you translate into one language or another. So I would say also edit for precision and legibility, not for accent erasure. So here, I mean, by accent, I don't necessarily mean translation or pronunciation. Sorry. I mean the marks of place, language, training, memory, social position that remain legible in writing. So when you're editing, particularly if you're editing first-time authors, and if you're editing our own work, I think here, if it's a particular language like Portuguese or Spanish or English, there's danger here that we make the text legible by making it sound like everyone else, where it's not the aim, right? The aim is precision. Can the reader follow the argument? Are the claims clear? Are the images doing the conceptual work that you wanted to do? So here, I don't mean erase the rhythm of someone thinking in them. So I think finally the ideally keep the knowledge answerable to locals that the knowledge returns. Okay, I think I've gone way over time, an hour and a half. Again, hopefully you watch all this. If you don't, well, I don't know. But I thank you if you do. If you've come this far, I will not edit. Sorry. Okay, bye.